Story and character overview. In this lesson, we'll be talking about story. We'll be looking at the characters, we'll be looking at very basic story structure, as much as we need to know for the purposes of this scenario. It's a very fun scenario and I hope you enjoy it. I strongly suggest you've read the script already before doing this lesson. So if you haven't, I suggest you pause and go and do that now. The basic premise of the scenario is that 4 goblins go out on an adventure to save their kidnapped grandmother. She's been kidnapped by some pesky frog boys who are like a rival clan, and they worship a giant ogre and they're going to sacrifice the goblin grandma to the ogre. The scenario and the script are designed to cover the main kind of broad strokes that you would find in any given short piece, like a cinematic sequence or a short sequence from film. So we've got, there's enough character in there, there's enough setup, there's enough adventure, there's enough escalating action, and a big climactic action sequence, and then a resolution. So in terms of what we need to be aware of with story for the purposes of this course and this lesson, are fairly basic. We don't need to go into super depth. There is an enormous amount of information out there about story theory, and it goes into great depth. We're just going to strip this right back to the very core components. What is the core of the story? If you strip everything away for it, what's really at the heart of it? Who are your characters? Story is nothing without characters. They are the entities that we follow through the story. Their experience is our experience as the audience. So we need to know who they are. We need to know what they want. We need to know what the quest is that they're on and what it means to them. Let's take a look at our 4 main goblin characters then. So we have designs for these. They're all really great. These were designed by Antonio. In my mind, related to one another, goblin brothers, perhaps, from a large family. From left to right, we have Wodan, who is the stoic veteran. He's the sword and board guy. So he's got his big metal wooden shield and a sword. Personality-wise, Wodan is very centered, very stable. He's definitely a stabilizing element. He's the more mature character of the group. He's also quite empathetic. He picks up on when Artemis is needing that bit of encouragement, so he's very much the mentor figure for Artemis as well. In terms of how he moves and fights and what kind of abilities or where he's best used in combat, he's not particularly acrobatic. He's in full armor here. He's going to stay grounded. He can certainly move at a good speed. He's more about being defensive and kind of maybe protecting others and getting in underneath the ogre or combating the frog boys in a way that he's protecting himself with his shield and he's striking with the sword. So pretty much your classic board and sword type character in terms of the combat. Wodan also acts as kind of like the centered leader of the group as well. So when they get to a new threshold, he's going to be the one that is the first one to take point and go out in front of the group as they say journey into the woodlands that they get to. So next character then is Artemis. He's arguably the main character. He's our little novice, our little inexperienced novice goblin. So he's come along for the journey because he wants to be involved, he wants to help save Grandma, and he wants to be brave, but he hasn't quite got it in him yet. When we meet him at the beginning of the script, we see that he's the one who's I always say, most emotionally vulnerable from the loss of the grandmother. He's clutching the photo tightly. He's kind of reluctant to play his part initially, and when he does, he's quite clumsy. But he does go along with it, and I think the important thing to remember with Artemis is that he does want to. He just can't quite find it in him until the moment when he can. And so as we're going forward, reading the script now, we need to be really looking for those moments, those key turning points in his character arc. Then we have Yoma, who is the slightly eccentric engineer type. He's probably the oldest of the group, but he has the air of mischief about him and a bit of cunning, and his design has a slight air of he's kind of falling into that slightly mad scientist kind of stereotype. So he has this big old rocket launcher. Initially that's used, for a utilitarian purpose, but later on it's also used as a weapon for him as he jams the frog boys in and starts using those as ammunition. So I think that also shows that he's quite quick-witted. He can adapt to any scenario given what he's got at his disposal, very creative. Then furthest over we have Vedak. So Vedak is our battle mage, essentially. He is by far the most powerful character in terms of potential for destruction in the group, without a doubt. So he has this massive berserker sword, and he also has the ability to create magic, fire magic. So he can either wield that like magical fire blast, or he can set his flame alight and make a giant flaming blade on the end of his sword. Very wild. I mean, look at him, right? You can just see his personalities coming out there. There's a wildness to that character, and that should be reflected in the way he moves. I think he can move with raw aggression, and he can jump and spin and clash and crash. He is your big hitter, but he's also quite arrogant about it. He's not going to be modest about his prowess at all. He's overconfident. He thinks that he could probably take this on his own, probably. And he acts that way at times, which gives us a nice kind of reversal when we get to the end with Artemis and Vedak. I think that comes full circle. Vedak is the first to anger. So when they get angry after thinking their grandmother's dead, Vedak is the first one to move. And he just goes off without thinking in an absolute rage. So there's our 4 main characters. Then we have the enemies. So we have the Frog Boys. So these will all be the same design. You can feel free to give them whatever weapons you want, or add any variations to them that you want as well. They kind of hop about the place. They're slightly deranged. When we first meet them, they're kind of hopping and chanting about the place, really happy that they've kidnapped Mavis. So there's an air of the comedic about them. They have simple needs and they have simple desires. And then I think when they fight, they can be quite chaotic and sort of unpredictable in their movements, and just play into that kind of like hopping frog type of motion. Then we have the Ogre. This guy is enormous. Another lovely design as well. Beautiful proportion on this. We've got a rough size comparison here with the silhouettes of the other characters. You don't have to take this literally. I think you can find whatever scale works for you as you go through it. It may well change as I go through it as well when I'm working my way through my examples. It's one of those things that because Mavis is around his neck, feels like he has to be about this big. So he's a big boy. He's big, muscular, will move with immense power, but obviously slower, because he's bigger. He could have a kind of ape quality about the way he moves. The arms are nice and long, so they could lean into that quite nicely. Immense power when he slams down and stomps around. We can also give him a club as well. It's written into the script. There's no design for that. It's just basically a rough old looking club. That'll help with the reach as well, and help the staging and add more interest into the variety of things he can do. He can also chomp on things, if he can get his head close enough to things, he can bite and chew things. So when the Frog Boys are fired at him, he can just eat them, swallow them whole. The only character we don't have an explicit design for is Mavis, so feel free to either riff on what I've done in the boards or to just design your own version of Mavis. The important thing about Mavis is that she has a very fancy hat, because that's her identifying design feature, and it plays into the story quite a bit. So it's very important she has a fancy hat. So the characters themselves as individuals now. Who are each of them? Who are your characters? What is each of your characters' motivation? What do each of them want in any given moment? This is both a story-wide consideration and a moment-to-moment consideration. For instance, what do they want? They want to save their grandmother. But while they're in the middle of a fight with 6 Frog Boys and their grandmother's not even there, their moment-to-moment motivation is to kill the Frog Boys. So there's a difference between boots on the ground level motivation and the wider character arc motivation. What is at stake if they fail? This is, again, reiterating a point we just made. It's a very important point, and it applies at all times on a broader scale, but also on a moment-to-moment scale. What is at stake if they fail? They lose their grandmother. They could also lose their lives. In the moment, when they're in the middle of a fight, if the Orc's club is swinging down on them from above, if they fail to act, they will get squashed, or they could break a leg, or their family member could get hurt. So there's all sorts of things in the moment that they can continuously fail at. What are their personalities? What are each of them like individually? By identifying this, you can really start to bring that out in any given moment. This will kind of lend into the performance and the way that each of these characters moves and the way that they interact with one another. It'll help make them distinct individuals. What are they strong at? What are they weak at? Are they physically strong, but mentally not necessarily weak, but shallow, perhaps? Or are they emotionally very deep and introverted, but are physically weak? Are they afraid? Are they overconfident? Are they balanced? Are they caring? What are they strong? weak at? Are they athletic? Are they clumsy? All of these things play into how you're going to perform these characters. What are their abilities? So this all folds into the same thing, right? It's just each of these categories, these questions that I'm asking right now, are for you to think about what makes each of these characters the character they are, and what do they have at their disposal as well. So this even comes down to like, what kind of actions are they actually literally, like moment to moment, specific actions are they going to perform when they're fighting? What does Artemis swinging a sword look like compared to what Vidak looks like when he swings a sword, or Wodan? What's the difference? Always put yourself in your character's mindset at any time, at all times. Whenever you're acting out a character, or you're taking characters through a story, or discovering something with them, put yourself in their mindset. Who are they? How do they see the world? How do they feel when they discover things? Just think about being them and how you would act if you were that character. If you're small, like Artemis, how do you feel when you encounter a Frogbite for the first time versus how Vedak feels when he encounters Frogbite for the first time? This also applies to the antagonists. There's that great saying, right, that every villain is the hero of their own story. And I think that's the best way to treat our antagonists. From their perspective, the Frog Boys are just doing what they do. They're kidnapping people and sacrificing them to their ogre god because the ogre god will be appeased. The ogre, what's the ogre doing, like from his perspective? So when you get to perform those characters out, you know, each of those characters, every character needs to be fighting for their life. Give them that kind of agency that you're giving the other characters. And the ogre, when you play with the ogre, when you're acting the ogre out, just again, try and put yourself in that perspective of like, what's that like to move at that size? How quickly could you respond to attacks coming from these tiny little characters buzzing about? It'll help. So that's the intro to our characters. So let's return to our story core and make our way through this. We need to know what the quest is that they're on and what it means to them. So in this case, the quest is rescue their grandmother. What is at stake? If they don't manage to do this, the grandmother gets killed, eaten perhaps. So what is at stake initially is the grandmother being killed. What's at stake later is then the grandmother being harmed because they know she's still alive. And then what's also at stake is our characters being harmed. What are the obstacles in their way to achieving their quest? Well, in a physical combative sense, we have the Frog Boys are the first enemy that they will encounter and have to overcome to get to their objective. But then the next big one is then the main one is the ogre when it comes out, and that radically escalates the stakes at play here, right? Because not only has the ogre come out and is a far more formidable enemy, Grandma is also around its neck. So now we have two obstacles. We have the ogre, who is enormous, but we also have the obstacle of trying not to hurt Grandma while we're fighting the ogre. When the characters are doing their bit and they're trying to lay their attacks on the ogre, they also have to be mindful not to strike Grandma. But outside of that, a few other obstacles that come to play in the story are they don't know initially where she is, right? So the initial obstacle is one of exploration. It's of uncertainty. Where in the unknown is Grandma? First obstacle they have to overcome is finding out where that is. And then another obstacle I would say that's really important on a character level is Artemis's own self-doubt. In his arc, he wants to be brave, but he can't quite find it in himself until he can. And so he's his own obstacle until the very end. And then overcoming himself is his victory. And that's the story of Artemis. You raise the stakes by stacking up more and more against the characters, more and more obstacles in their way, or the seriousness of those obstacles escalating, or the scale of them escalating. As with all the other principles, this is relevant in the moment to moment as much as it is in the overall structure. So we're talking on a broader story structure there, but we're also talking on a moment to moment. The danger, the peril at any given moment of action. It's also why giving it characters agency is so important. If a character can't act against an obstacle, if a character is passive, then the obstacle will overcome them and they fail the quest. They have to become active or find ways to become active and overcome those obstacles in order to achieve their objective and win. What are the themes? Well, there's certainly a theme of a small unit, a small family here at work, and the interactions between them. I would say that the way the script is written, the character who has the biggest transformation, the biggest journey, is Artemis, the young novice. So if you can pay careful attention to his journey through the script, I think you'll pull out some themes there as well. You know, it's very much about Artemis, who is quite an afraid little character, having to find the confidence and the strength to be more active and to become the hero by the end of the script. What is the tone? There's quite a lot at stake from their perspective. To them, it's a serious thing. They're going on a serious mission here. But they are also silly goblin characters, you know, at least a few of them are. And their enemy, their dreaded enemy, the Frog Boys, are very silly little characters. This is not like a super serious tone to the film. But there is also danger, right? They could get hurt. They could die. It's a balancing act between something that feels like it has weight and it matters to them, but also to not be afraid to drop in comedy now and again, just to kind of liven it up a bit and just keep it light. It doesn't have to be super dark. I think personally it feels best to have a kind of balanced tone on this one. So once you've had a good think about this stuff, these are the things you need to keep as your baseline going forward. So anytime you're boarding the characters out and you're thinking about what you wanted to do next or how they would act within the scene, if you just come back to these core principles, you'll find your answers. Just want to very quickly touch on the 3-act structure or the 6-stage plot structure. They overlap quite nicely into one another. We don't need to go too deep into this, but it will help in our breakdown of the script in order to understand which part of the script correlate to this kind of pattern, this kind of structure. So there are things in a 3-act structure that are going to fit quite nicely, and there are things in the 6-stage plot structure that are also going to fit quite nicely. So I think you can refer to both of them, whichever one is more relevant at any given time. In a nutshell, a 3-act structure works something like this. Act 1 is usually like setup and exposition. So it's who are we, what's the quest, where are we going, what's the film going to be about, and then you get on the move. The Act 2 is usually then the progress of that and the confrontations that happen in the middle of the story. As we go out on our adventure, we start to encounter obstacles, we start to come across various confrontations, we might have a twist, and then that will build up to a climax, usually towards the end of Act 2. And then the 3rd act is playing off of the climax of Act 2. It's the climax and the resolution of the entire story. Typically, you will have, you'll be building up in this diagonal in terms of ramping up the intensity of the action toward the final third, and then it'll peter off. And once you've finished that rising action, you'll kind of drop then into what we call the resolution and the ending, the falling action. Just a few kind of quick examples of where this stuff fits into our story. So I would say if we're going from the 3-act structure at the top, I would argue that the inciting incident, the inciting event has already happened, like before the script, and that would be the grandma getting taken. The call to action, again, has already happened. They're already on the way. So in terms of Act 1 in the 3-act structure, we've already kind of covered quite a bit of that outside of the script. So if we go down to the 6-stage plot structure at the bottom, I think these are a little more relevant to our kind of Act 1. So you have setup, turning point 1 opportunity, and new situation. So we set up what this is all about. Here's our characters. They're on a mission. We've established what that mission is about via the photo. And then there's the opportunity comes then when Artemis goes up into the air and they find where Grandma is. So that then gives them the thrust forward then to go, okay, now we know where she is. We have the opportunity to save her still. So I think you could also argue that that acts as our kind of climax of Act 1, in that there's an excitement that builds there, and it acts as a very punctuated moment in the script and a turning point. So down the bottom in the 6-stage plot structure, you'll see things like turning point, change of plans, point of no return, right? So change of plans in this would be more that they didn't know where they were going, but now they do. So then once we're into Act 2, they progress, they keep going forward, they move towards their targeted objective, which we've already established now. What we have then is when we arrive at that central point, which is where they get to the line of trees and they look over into the ritual, the midpoint twist is there that the grandma isn't there now. So they were operating on the assumption initially that he was still alive. They had that confirmed, but now they get to the middle and there's a midpoint twist. They think she's dead now. So that changes things, right? So that then completely flips what their attitude was towards this. This was a rescue mission. Now it's revenge, So we have what would that be, would come into down here is we've had the progress towards that point. We've had the midpoint twist, and then we get the complications and highest stakes. The complication would be they think she's dead. It's changed their attitude. Now it's revenge. And so then we have the next obstacle, which would be the Frog Boys. They have to take the Frog Boys down. Then we also have the rising stakes in the arrival of the ogre. Now, obviously, that changes things because they know Grandma's alive again. So that again shifts the kind of the focus of what they're doing, or at least the underlying possibility here, right? They could save Grandma again. Now, it's not purely about revenge, even though they still want revenge. We have the crisis moment is basically when everything is almost lost, right? So this will be the bit where the ogre is absolutely wiping the floor with them, and everyone's kind of getting beaten down, right? They've all had their moment to shine, but now they're getting beaten down, and it's then that something new has to be introduced, or a development has to happen somewhere in order to overcome that beating that they're taking, and that will be Artemis finding the strength within himself to get involved, and also his genius little plan that he has for his little special move that he does, utilizing everyone's strength in order to take down the ogre. And that gives us the climax of Act 2 then. This acts as the both the final push and the climax of Act 2, where everyone's kind of bandying together, and then there's the big crescendo of all that action. And then the climax of the novel is basically like the ogre would be dead at that point. So that's the ogre being killed. That's like the end of the action, basically, the turning point 5 climax. And then once that's completed in Act 3, where we've got the climax of the novel, basically, we then have this falling action here, which is basically everything's calming down now, right? There's no more conflict happening. It's done. This is like the epilogue section. So the resolution here is that they've defeated the ogre, they've saved Grandma, and now they get a nice little epilogue with Grandma, and that's the end of the story, right? So everything's sorted then by the end. And that's basically how that 3-act structure works in relation to our script. Hopefully that helps understand how a structure like this, a diagram like this, corresponds to a script. Because, as I said earlier, right, there's an entire discipline built around story structure, and we don't need to know all of that for this. But the 3-act structure is a very, very common structure that you will find, particularly in straightforward action scenarios, right? And it works nicely. It fits most scenarios, will fall into this quite nicely. And I would say fairly typically when you're working professionally, a lot of the content that you're going to be working on will fall into these categories. So when you get scripts, you can now use this to help you break down those professional scripts as well. And I would also suggest further reading into story theory if you're really interested in that.